Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Thinking Strategies for Crafting Constructed Responses, Part 2, One Step at a Time. I'm Bonnie Goonan. I'm here with Susan Pittman, as well as Daphne Atkinson and Debbie Fawcett. And we're so glad that all of you are joining us this afternoon, especially since we were talking. I'm sure that many of you are already on summer break, and we have a holiday weekend coming in. So we are thrilled that each and every one of you are joining us. Today, what we're going to be doing is exploring the thinking routines to teach those actual steps in drafting a constructed response. We started last time in talking about what is evidence, etc., but today we're really going to take you through each of the steps that we need to be utilizing in our classrooms. We're also going to take a little look at how do we take students writing from that scorable 0 to a 1. Yes, Susan and I know that there is two-level writing, but we want to take it one step at a time. And then, of course, as always, we're going to share some resources and ideas. But before we get started, Susan, let's take just a real quick poll of everyone in our group and get a little background information.
Okay, so let's start out with this first one. And the question is, did you attend the May Tuesday for Teachers webinar? And all you need to do is select yes or no. And if you're having trouble remembering back to May, since it is June now and everybody's kind of wrapping up for the year, but let's see how many we have. And Bonnie, we have 74% of people who have voted. So we're going to hold for 5 seconds more just to see if we can pick up a few more people. And we will close the poll. So I'm going to close, and let's take a look at the results. And Bonnie, gee, this looks like some of the voting that happened over in Great Britain. We have 53% no and 47% yes. So about an even split here in terms of those who were with us versus those who weren't. So that gives us a little idea of where we are at this point in time. So let me hide that one. And at this point, let's talk a little bit more, because some of you were with us, and let's see if some people have used some of the information. So back in May, we really talked about different types of evidence using materials from that webinar. So if you would, please let us know yes, no, or have not accessed those materials. And while we're running this particular poll, we'll just remind everybody that, you know, all of these webinars are archived on the GED Testing Service website. So please take advantage, even if you can't participate live at the time of the webinar itself. Make sure that you go in and that you take a look at those materials afterwards. That gives you a chance to watch the webinar itself, but also get all those goodies that go along with it. And having said that, Bonnie, we're going to close this poll, and we'll share the results. And it looks to me, Bonnie, like 29% of people, yes, they have been able to work with students on these different types of evidence. I think that's a really good thing that we're seeing people put some of those into place. And for those of you who've not accessed the materials, take a few moments and do so, if at all possible, after this particular webinar. So, Bonnie, shall we do another one?
Let's do another one, because for those of you, and even those of you who did not access the materials, we know that sometimes there are certain things that are difficult for our students to do when they are working on evidence or argumentative writing. So we have a few choices for you to look at here as far as what do your students, or what did your students find most difficult?
So, in terms of looking at it, do your students find it's difficult to identify different types of evidence? Do they have a problem when they're going to do the extended response, determining the best supported argument? You know, which one has stronger evidence? Or how about providing a rationale for why the argument was best supported? All of those things really have been challenges for our students, but let's take a look and see where we are in terms of where that greatest difficulty is. And Bonnie, I see a trend here occurring in the poll where, and I think maybe, we have this supported in many different ways by research that the GED Testing Service has done, is students really are having difficulty providing a rationale for why the argument is best supported. So we'll close that poll and share the results. And you can see that that's sitting at 40%. And Bonnie, don't you agree? I can find the argument, I decide that one's best supported, but I don't know how to put those pieces together.
That's so true. I was listening to Daphne Atkinson and Marty Key talk the other day, and they were talking about, as they're reading, as they're looking and analyzing some of the written responses, that many of our students continue to have a difficult time connecting that evidence to the argument. And so that's the same thing we're talking about here. Yes, I can determine evidence. Yes, I can determine the best supported argument. But then I have a problem in providing that rationale. So we're going to talk a little more about that today.
Okay, and I believe we have one more question, Bonnie. And
yes,
so this one is really about, and kind of a reminder as well, whether or not you have an opportunity to go back and visit that GED Testing Service archive, the webinar archive. And if you didn't know it existed, we need to know that, so we push out there for people to understand that these things are all available to you, not just today, but as we move on into the future.
So, Susan, are we seeing how often those archives are accessed?
Well, actually we are. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to close the poll. We have about 75% who have voted. And I'm going to share those results. And so what we're seeing here is that we have some of you who have not ever visited that webinar archive, and we hope that maybe this will kind of entice you a little bit for finding the materials that are there. But also it does say, Bonnie, that we need to make sure people are aware that it's out there, and it's a resource that people can access throughout the year. So, but we're also very pleased to see that we have those of you who are kind of regular visitors that are coming out and taking a look at things. So, Bonnie, I think that pretty much will take care of our polls for today. So how about let's dig down into where we're going with these thinking routines. Bonnie, what are you talking about with a thinking routine?
Well, we talked briefly the last time about making thinking processes visible, and so today we're just going to do a very quick review because it's really an important part of teaching. Many of our students really believe that all we do is we look at a prompt, we read something, and off we go. We write, and we write beautifully, and we never ever have to think through. So in order to make our students more effective writers, we have to first make our own thinking processes visible to them as we identify and integrate effective writing routines. The other thing that Susan and I really strongly believe in, and we know it's true, is that we have to scaffold instruction and model it, and that takes time. There's no way to teach the writing process in one lesson plan or one day's activities. We really have to look at how we identify routines to teach, how we determine which pieces of the writing process will be taught in a session, and then as we model it, that we ask ourselves purposeful questions so students can see how we think through writing, that it's not that we just write. And we all have seen this type of a structure before, where if we're really looking at guided practice, we know that we have to focus the instruction first by us doing it. Then we work with students, so we do it together. Then we have small groups of students collaborating and doing the routine together. And finally, students are able to do it independently. You know, too often we teach those multiple steps in a routine, and that becomes very confusing and overwhelming to our students. So as we look at teaching any important process, and let's face it, constructed responses are a very, very necessary skill. We always have to think of how we're going to create the structure that works so that eventually our students are able to own that process and do everything independently. So when we're talking about one step at a time, the last session, the session in May, we talked about analyzing the prompt, closely reading and interacting with the text, and analyzing and evaluating the evidence. In fact, we used a number of routines that we'll reference today, but we won't dig deeply into them because we've already done it. However, today we are going to look at how do we teach students to actually plan or organize the essay, and a constructed response is termed an essay. We're going to talk about crafting that claim and connecting evidence, talking about a counterclaim rebuttal, crafting that conclusion, and then putting it all together, revising, editing, and finally publishing. Boy, that's a lot of stuff to do today, Susan.
Ooh, yes, it is. So I guess that means we better rock and roll with it, huh?
I
Okay,
think
so
so.
what are we trying to look at here? It comes down to we really want students to be able to state that claim. What's being argued, what points are being made. Those are the things that we want students to understand. What is a claim and what does it mean? We talked at the last session about evidence, and we really want to stay away from our students' personal opinions because remember, they're writing about something about they've read. So that makes a difference. It's not about them. It's about what they've read. Bonnie talked a little bit earlier about the importance of having that connection between the evidence and the claim itself, and it kind of explaining, because otherwise all you have is a claim, and you might as well have bullet points as far as that goes, if you don't have a way to connect it, to show a bridge and how it works. Now, as you get on up into some of the higher order writing, and not to say that our students at a level 1 can't do this, but what we tend to see at that level 2 is that ability to use that counterclaim to say, well, this author said, and then do that rebuttal. However, I believe this is, or the author has shown, da-da-da-da-da, that this has made a difference. I mean, those are things that we would love for our students to have that ability to do that counterclaim and that rebuttal. But I have to say, Bonnie, as I'm looking at this thing, if we could just write this at this point in time, work on this bridge, that could make a big difference for our students as they're moving through. And of course, we don't want them to just pop to the end and say, the end. We really want to have them be able to close out what they've written. And, it's that conclusion is that last attempt to really convince the reader that the claim that's made is the best position on the issue. So those are all the different components that we want to work with as we're moving through. So having said that, Bonnie, let's start with, developing a claim and kind of what all it takes to get there, to do that.
That sounds good. When we make our thinking processes visible for our students in crafting that constructed response, first of all, we're going to use the same two source texts that we did in May. And very briefly, one is a press release from the Office of a U.S. Representative, and one is a letter to the editor. And both of these folks have developed materials that tell us why or why not a bypass should be built. A bypass from the attitude of the representative as being a wonderful thing and her reasons why, a bypass not being a good thing by a local person who again is providing reasons why that bypass will harm the town. So as we talked the last time, we're going to use these two stimulus pieces before a student ever starts doing anything with the writing. Remember that a student first has to unpack the prompt, analyzing it well, closely read and interact with source text, determine the evidence from both sides, and then analyze and evaluate the evidence. Now, you're noticing that on the bottom of this slide it says workbook pages 10 to 17. We're going to go through the workbook in a little bit, but what we're going to tell you is everything that we're going to talk about. The routines, the graphic organizers, both blank ones and completed ones, are going to be included in your workbook so that when you go back to your classroom, you're going to have everything you need to implement this step-by-step process for writing an effective constructed response. So, Susan, I know that we unpacked the prompt the last time, and it said that our students were supposed to basically look at both sides of the argument and determine the best supported. Now, I also know the last time that we had our participants analyze and evaluate the evidence using something called Both Sides Now. What's Both Sides Now?
Well, actually, it's one of those modern marvels. It's such a basic graphic organizer, but it truly does allow students to do what they need to do when they're reading this text. It provides them a way to take each piece and analyze it to identify evidence. And so you can see from the slide, we have both sides now, and on the left side of that graphic organizer, we have evidence that supports. On the right-hand side, we have evidence that opposes. Now, the student has what we've talked about in the past, Bonnie, closely read or interacted with the text and has found evidence for both of those sides, and they're just right there beside each other. So that allows the student now to, they've evaluated, they've analyzed, which is how they pulled all that out, but now having them side by side, I can look at it and say, oh, let me evaluate what this looks like, because I need to see which is better supported. So now put my evaluation hat on, and I'm able to go through and say, okay, I'm going to pick a decision. I'm going to make a decision. I'm going to select one of these positions. And so that becomes my claim. And if you take a look at that, here's my decision point. My decision is, hey, the supporting side has won. But there's more to it than this. There's got to be a reason why that claim is stronger. Otherwise, we're just saying, oh, well, Representative Wallace has the better supported position. Well, what does that tell anybody? Nothing. We have to have reasons for that. And you can see the reasons. Start out with the press release provides a stronger argument because it provides more positive and factual evidence. So now the student has gone that full cycle that we needed them to do of analyzing and evaluating the text, building that claim itself, and starting to lay out the case of how that can be proven that it's better supported.
Could I use the other side, Susan? Could I say, when I compare those two positions and I look at that evidence side by side, I think the evidence that opposes it is better supported.
Absolutely, because it's going to come back to the fact of, they're different types of evidence that comes in, but both sides have presented pretty strong arguments. Now it's just a case of, based on what you're seeing, what does that evidence say to you? That which is stronger, which is better supported? And not only that, Bonnie, but it really doesn't have to be the one you agree with. because sometimes that gets in students' way because, you know, they may see something and they go, well, you know, I would do this, but the other one is stronger. You don't have to agree with that side. You're making the case as you're moving through. But you are staying away from that, and you have to be careful about it. And it's not about what I think. It's about really analyzing and evaluating to see how that author presented things. So we have to be cautious when we start talking about, well, I think this is better. It is better. Let's try to get them into that third person and into that more formal.
So this is really the pre-work for your students. If we can get students to not only analyze the prompt, but then to determine the different pieces of evidence, which is absolutely necessary before we write a claim, then writing the claim and the reasons for that claim become much easier. Sometimes we see in materials that students write the claim and then support it with evidence. That's backwards. They need to first of all identify the evidence. Then they can contrast both sides. They can determine which is better supported. And guess what? They even have enough evidence already identified to do a counterclaim and a rebuttal. It really is all about planning before we start writing. So Susan, it looks like to me that if we have students do this Both Sides Now graphic organizer, it should be a real piece of cake for them to craft their claim.
Absolutely, because everything is there. The evidence is all there, and the assertion, as you say, the assertion you're making, and the reasons why you're making it, that is what makes a claim. So once we've done that evaluation piece, we can go forward and we can set that claim. And remember, we want that claim to be something that is debatable. Somebody could disagree with it. There's nothing wrong there. We don't want it to be like all over the board. We really, you know, we're narrowing this to what we've read. And does it give us, because you always need to think about that claim, as kind of the blueprint. That lays out kind of the roadmap or the blueprint for how we continue in building what we're doing. So let's take a look at this one now. If we take a look at the claim, it says, while both sides make an acceptable case, Representative Walls provides a stronger argument for the road construction bill. And notice there's that nice little word in there, because. Because the press release provides more factual and valid evidence. So now that tells me, Bonnie, that as I'm going through this, I should be seeing some facts that are going through that. I mean, this is being built on the fact it's more factual, so I should be looking for those.
Definitely, and I think that that's one of the things that I've seen students have so much difficulty. If all they say is one side's better than the other, then how do I support it with evidence if I don't have that because? That makes just so much sense. And you're right, I should be looking for factual evidence to support it and evidence that's more valid than the other side makes. So let's take a look at that next step in the process, because I want students to be able to write such excellent claims before I go the next step.
Okay,
so,
and I'm going to, before we go further, because we're having a little bit of some audio problems, and a part of that is the fact that Bonnie and I are sitting in a hotel. And so in some cases, a portion of this is the speed of our the Wi-Fi that we're on. So I'll apologize for that up front. That I know that at times it is going in and out, or every now and then it's picking up a little tinny. So we will try to even it out as much as we can, but since Bonnie is also running the PowerPoint, that puts a little bit more strain on her Wi-Fi than it does on mine. So Bonnie, I'm sorry, but we just had so many different questions popping in.
Definitely, and I totally agreed. It's the joys of the internet on the road. So we are with citing and connecting evidence, and we put that together because As we said previously, what GED testing service is seeing is that finally our students are beginning to be able to cite evidence. The problem is they're not connecting or explaining how that evidence connects to the claim. So I may be giving a quote or a paraphrase or a summarization of something, but I'm not telling you how it supports the claim by being more factual, being more valid, or whatever terminology I've used. So remember, for this particular one, since we selected the prose side, the press release, we want to make sure that we have original text that focuses on factual and valid evidence because it's that important part of the claim. And remember, there are lots of different types of evidence. If you remember from May, it's not just about facts and stats. It can also be such things as professional information or opinions. It can be, that personal struggle at the heartstrings kind of information. It can be evidence that the average person would know is true, such as if we have a road that bypasses the whole town, there may be an issue. The common person knows that if roads don't go through town, businesses can really be hurt economically. So if you're not aware of the different types of evidence, make sure that you and your students know that. The information is both in the packet and was a major part of what we did at this last webinar. But having said that, Susan, take a look for us at how do we teach the modeling of how to cite the evidence. What's one great strategy we can use?
Well, it comes down to this thing, which is basically state, cite, and explain. And so what you want to try to do in going through this process is to model for students how they're going to go in and they're going to find information and then pull it out piece by piece. Now, yes, I know that when they get into the test itself, it's timed, and students will always say to you, but I don't have time to do all those things. However, if this is something that you work on within the classroom, what happens is that students are able to get this process in their head. So they begin to do it as a habit of mind, and that's part of what we want students to do. So let's just take a look at this first part of the graphic organizer. So they have the question, and we know that this question basically boiled down to, was this highway transit bill beneficial or not? And I've made my decision in terms of whatever my claim is. And so a few minutes ago you saw that we were looking at the claim from the points that were being made by representative was stronger. So we have a statement here. The bill will prove advantageous because the research provides strong arguments supporting it. Okay, so we have this statement that comes in, and it's tied to that evidence. What evidence are we going to cite that to, Bonnie? We're going to need to do something specifically with this, because it's not enough to just say, oh, well, it proves blah, blah, blah. Now we got to have something that supports this from the text itself. So as we take a look at it, we want to be careful, because we want to make sure that if we're going to cite it explicitly, we got to be careful how we do that. If we paraphrase it, or maybe we are going to use a quote, because sometimes that quote can put that really nice emphasis to it. But all of you have the same issues that Bonnie and I have had with students when it comes to quotes, and that's that they tend to use too many of them. And so let's make sure that we have students working in different ways. So this is about going in and really combining what the reading says and then your own thoughts in order to create that new meaning. So when we cite, we go, well, from the article we saw, improving the highway means jobs for local construction workers and for workers after the road is completed. Okay, I puts away that it is pretty advantageous. Now, how do I connect that? What am I going to do at that point in time? I've got to explain. I've made my statement, I've cited some evidence, but there's a connection that has to go along with that. And in that connection, I'm going to explain how that supports my overall idea. So let's take a look and see one and how that does support it. And it says, although the construction jobs are temporary, the road expansion will bring in more tourists and new businesses, which will provide local people with long-term job opportunities and lower the unemployment rate. Wow. I've gone all the way through and I've connected and shown them how it's going to be advantageous.
Susan, I don't think those words were exactly in the source text, were they?
I sure hope not, because I do want to make sure that I am taking that text and I am paraphrasing and I am making inferences and I am pulling all that material together, because it needs to be my writing now. I'm the one who's explaining, not just, I don't want to go in and just take everything that the author said, because I think then we have that plagiarism word that's in there, if I'm going to just pull everything in and copy that original text.
Wow, that sounds like a lot of work.
Actually, it's not as difficult as we often want to say it is, but it is work. And it is something that what we have to get used to in the classroom is doing this on a regular basis. Because how do we learn anything? How did you learn how to play the piano, Bonnie?
Oh, I
Did you just
practiced and
magically?
practiced and practiced, but I practiced pieces first
That's
before I put
right.
it all together. Yes.
It's the same process that we take and we break it into smaller parts so that we can scaffold our instruction. We can do this and keep adding pieces to it, because remember, we're not trying to teach students, oh, everything under the sun about writing and doing argumentative essays. We want them to know how to do specific parts, but let's break them down so that it's not so overwhelming. But then we got to have practice in order to really, what do they say? Practice makes perfect. Well, I'm not even looking for perfect, but I'd like to move in that direction.
Okay, that then maybe is not as difficult as I thought, because if we put it all together, it makes sense. And if I remember right, the prompt doesn't necessarily tell us that we have to have X number of pieces of evidence. We just need to have multiple pieces. And to me, if I'm teaching students how to identify 3 pieces of evidence, 4 pieces of evidence, but if there's strong evidence and I explain well, then I'm going to have a much better crafted, constructed response than if I just list lots and lots of evidence. So,
Well, I mean, we
they,
have, I want you to go back, Bonnie, and I want you to think, and you don't have to go back in the PowerPoint, but I want you to think in terms of, we had that list of evidence from both sides.
that's right.
Part of what we do within this is to say, in looking at this, if I were going to try to convince somebody that this is the strongest one, these 3 things stand out to me, or these 4 things stand out to me as the best pieces of evidence. The rest of them, probably I can't explain them as well. But our students can do this, because it even says, I've got to use evidence from both articles. So I got to be careful, that I don't just concentrate everything on one and don't pull anything in from the other as well. So, but again, I don't need 9 pieces when I can have 3 strong ones.
I can see how if we would do more practice of this state cite explain routine, then it will be much easier for our students to both identify the evidence that they want to cite and then to be able to do that warrant or bridge, that connection piece. Okay, here's a piece of evidence, and it says Oak Falls has a high unemployment rate due to the closing of a large factory. Boy, that almost sounds like that's the other side's evidence, but I can take this piece of evidence and show students how I can connect it. Because one example of the pro column stronger argument is that explanation that that new improved highway can have long-term benefits. And here again, they talked about that a completed highway is going to lead to new businesses. And if I've got new businesses in town, my unemployment rate, which right now is devastating, is going to be lessened. And that's the type of evidence and the type of connection that, yes, I'm making an inference, but it is a commonly known fact that when new businesses come into a town, there is less unemployment, even though the article might have not stated that exactly. It did infer that connection piece. And all of a sudden, it looks like what I have here is not only a really strong piece of evidence, but I also have that bridge, that connection piece. And that's part of trait 1 that oftentimes our students are missing, because it is important to connect. So,
Bonnie, before you go on, let's bring in a question, because we have one from Ebony, and she says, my student struggles with pulling themselves out of the writing, and they tend to write, I would choose or oppose this. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because as we're connecting this evidence, the evidence is not coming from our heads, it's coming from somewhere else.
You know, it's very difficult, especially for some of our beginning writers, to get out of, I choose this side of the argument. I'm going to tell you that we will have a writing sample for you today, a little bit later, that uses that I word in the beginning paragraph. And it's not like, oh my goodness, it got a 0 or anything, although it weakens the formality of the structure. So even if our students get started saying, I think this side is better supported, we really need to get them into, every time they cite evidence and connect it, take a look as they're editing and revising and say, how can you see this from the author's point of view? The other thing that we believe in is something called sentence frames. And so in your workbook, I believe it's on page 22, you'll have a list of frames for incorporating evidence that will take them out of that I. So as they're revising and editing, if they say, I think because, they'll be able to rewrite those sentences. A little bit of revision goes a long way, and they really do get used to taking that more formal style. But again, I think we need to be real careful as we get started in getting the ideas on paper and then going back and revising and editing. And also letting them know that this is, again, writing about what they've read as opposed to writing about what their opinions are. Very, very different type of writing. And it's going to take a little bit of time for some of our students to see that connection. Probably the best question is this what the author said? And if they say, no, it's what I think, then we've got to take them back to what the author said. I will tell you that by using something such as both sides now, where they're identifying the evidence from both source texts, then all of a sudden it does give them enough evidence to use as they're writing, and they won't need to always go with I think, because again, the building block for evidence based on the source text is right there in front of them on one piece of paper or one chart. So just a couple ideas, from sentence frames to really setting up the different authors' evidence in both sides now will definitely help. But then also at that revision time, really taking the time in classroom to have them go back and rewrite to get the opinion out. All of these things take some time, but they will end up with positive outcomes. Other questions?
I think okay, and we just need to make sure that Jamie Epstein is talking about, says we focus more on whether the argument has good support, like expert testimony or recent research. Your focus seems to be a bit more on the author is correct. And actually, no, and I hope we didn't lead you that way, because that expert testimony, the statistics, all of those different pieces of data make a difference in terms of the strength of the evidence that's going in there. However, it does come back to there is no right or wrong. Neither one of these authors is quote unquote correct. It can be argued either way, and so our students just need to know that they're not going to. The fear they have is that if I don't pick the right side, then I'm going to lose points, and that's not true. It does come back to having students use evidence. What we did expand on, and this comes back from our May webinar, was the fact that we can use more than research, studies, data, statistics, expert testimony. There are other pieces of evidence that can be used. So just to make sure that we get that have an understanding between those. And I think, Bonnie, we have one more, and this one is from Pam, who says, my students would have no idea that a new business might come into town. Inference on this level is something my students would see as fiction.
You know, and that is one idea. Again, it depends upon our students. Remember that that specific idea does not need to be inserted into, you know, the writing sample to be good. It's just an example. So another situation would be on the other side of the argument. Someone could say that this is not a great idea because although there will be construction jobs, once the highway is built, those jobs are gone. So that would be for the other side. So there's many ways to make inference, but you do bring up a great point. And that is students need to have time in your classroom where they're learning different ways to connect, different ways to read basically between the lines, and that's not only a writing skill of writing that way, but definitely a skill absolutely necessary as part of our close reading process. But inferences have been a problem forever. They're not going to go away anytime quickly, that is for sure. So that connection piece could be as simple as when someone provides evidence and it comes from a recent study that that connection piece is that this particular source text has provided recent studies as opposed to studies done back in the 1990s. So lots of ways to provide connection that may be a little bit clearer and not as much, shall we say, based upon living for a few years. Susan and I have some life skills that many of our younger students may not have yet.
Okay, so let's talk briefly, because we do have a couple of questions that have come in regarding that one sample that's at the level 1 writing that's in the book. So let's go ahead, Bonnie, and let's talk a little bit about the counterclaim and rebuttal. And from there, let's really do take a look at what we're talking about in the those different materials. So,
okay, for every claim, there's somebody else's opinion. Yes.
For every claim, there's somebody out there who's going to say, however, or not so fast. But those are the kinds of things. And one thing is actually to allow students to have an opportunity to, even in other writing, to find counterclaims. I mean, there's so many different ways that you could expose students to this type of thing, so that they're beginning to see how in a letter to the editor there may be a counterclaim that's put in there and a rebuttal. Sometimes our students need to see that type of thing. Maybe they're just not as aware of it, and they need to understand the language of those counterclaims and rebuttals as well. So let's take a quick look at an example that we have in your PowerPoint itself. So if I can get Bonnie to move to the next slide for us. You can see in this one that the counterclaim set basically lays out that the letter to the editor argues that the creative will be temporary or will provide poor salaries. Now remember, the claim over here was that the press release from the representative was better, so now we're making a counterclaim. However, here comes the rebuttal. The author of the letter to the editor provides no evidence or factual backing to support her claim. That's what we'd like for students to be able to do, is to make that counterclaim and rebut that so that they can come back, and it just makes their own claim that much stronger.
So we've now set up the pieces. We have the claim, we have the pieces of evidence with connections, we have a counterclaim, and we have a rebuttal. So really, except for the conclusion that aha at the ending, we have what we need to write. And the structure for constructed responses, please don't think that we need a paragraph for each thing. We don't need a paragraph separate for everything from a claim to etc. However, we do need to have a beginning, a middle, and an ending. So as students write, they will want that intro piece where they set their claim. They're setting that stage of what's being argued. They have that hook that gets the reader's attention. Sometimes the hook is not great, but again, we've got that beginning piece. And in the middle, we know that we have to provide the evidence, the connection, the counterclaim, and the rebuttal. Those pieces of information should be in the middle part of writing. And the ending should be something that's a little different. It really should tell the reader exactly why that reader should agree with the writer. And there's lots of different routines, lots of different drafting routines, lots of different graphic organizers. Susan and I will tell you that one of the graphic organizers is a true outline. Neither one of us ever did well with outlines. However, we know that some of our students loved outlines. We did better with graphic organizers. It doesn't matter what you use or what students use as long as they get into the process of using the same thing over and over. Because this is another problem that was reported by a GED testing service, and that is the fact that our students, when they get to the test, are not using those boards to do anything except use the boards to just sit there. That should be their planning instrument, as should the highlighting tool, etc. But again, the process that you use, the type of graphic organizer, doesn't matter as much as the fact that students are getting those basic structures in there. So it could be something as simple as this, that they write their claim in, they provide their evidence and support, they provide a counterclaim and rebuttal, and they provide a conclusion. Now, this is very, very short, and it's not necessarily meant to be a full essay, but it gives you an idea of what information should be in each segment. Again, all I would have to do with that first paragraph or the claim is to set the stage a little bit better of what they're arguing about, you know, what's this topic they're dealing with, the evidence and support, again, pull a little more in there. Counterclaim and rebuttal, I probably don't need much more than that, although I would need to correct that one editing issue there. And then the conclusion. Again, notice that some of these are not completed sentences, but they're ideas like we would have. And then it's time to write. And so, Susan, do we actually go to a writing sample first so that folks can see a little bit?
I think so. I think that would be a really good idea for us to take a look. In fact, if we just pop on over to a few slides, let's take a look at, and we can stay in the PowerPoint if you want to, or
I've
in the
already
repeated
gone
one, whichever one you prefer. And you may want to bring that up in size just a little bit, even though it maybe won't cover the entire page.
Better?
Yes.
Okay. This is a sample writing from GD Testing Service. I'm going to tell you up front it's a level 111. It was written by an adult ed student within the time frame. So we're not looking at perfect writing, but we are looking at the type of constructed response that would get a 111, which I think is the first step we want students to have. So if you look at that first paragraph where this particular student sets the claim, the student did say, I believe that Highway 17 should be expanded from a 2-lane highway to a 4-lane highway due to the better support it has. There are many benefits of extending it, although it may seem negative at times. We need to look at the broader picture as well as some specifics. Overall, expanding the highway will create new jobs and communities, therefore helping economically, and also will help decrease traffic congestion. Now, I'm going to tell you it is not a perfectly written paragraph, as all of you see, but this student has identified a claim. And I could easily help my student, if this is how he or she wrote, take it into a more formal style, but the actual idea for the claim is there. As you look through this page, what I want you to notice is how this student identifies evidence. Are there any connection pieces? And is there a counterclaim and a rebuttal? So I'm going to be quiet for just a moment or so while you read through this. Okay, Susan, if my students wrote something like this, I would go, yay, because as I looked through this sample piece of writing, I could actually have something to go that next level. Because trait one, we know, is having our students, analyze that argument and set up the claim and the connection pieces. And to me, it's evident that this writer really did analyze the issue, because he or she states the highway should be expanded due to the better support that it has. And again, we have that claim in the first paragraph. I also noticed that this particular writer revisits that claim in the last paragraph, stating, overall, there seems to be stronger evidence that building the new highways will help communities and decrease traffic congestion. So those two reasons, helping the community and decreasing traffic congestion, should be what the type of evidence is that that student or that writer then again provides. Did you find anything within evidence evidence that really did deal with helping their communities and decreasing traffic congestion? Were there quotes and connection pieces?
Well, as you go through these different pieces, you can take a look in the second paragraph, and that is the fact that they've acknowledged that those two major factories had closed down. And so the hopes of having some new jobs coming in as a result of this is important for the people who were there, and has been stated within that particular thing. The other thing as you're going through there is that having those roads completed allows more tourists in. So again, the student keeps using the evidence that is tied from that representative wall's information. So it's not a matter of the student has thought all this stuff up. Could they clarify a little bit more in terms of this? Could we do some editing and working with this student to get it in a more formal style? Absolutely. But at the same time, this student has done what it was asked in terms of finding the evidence that's going to support different things. Look at the fourth paragraph where you have the 18-wheeler traffic. That was another thing that was mentioned about reducing noise and wear and tear on the roads. So we see those different pieces.
But Susan, I think had this student been taught to use both sides now, then we would have provided a little more formal style where instead of just saying this stuff, the student would have better understood that the author or the representative said this, the author of the newsletter to the editor said that, because I think right now the student probably had read it, but really didn't analyze the evidence using something like both sides now or a pro-con chart. Again, that type of knowledge base of having gone through that process also can help formalize writing as they know Representative Wall said this study said that, adding a little more formality to the process just by that pre-reading strategy.
Absolutely. And there's another question that came in, and a comment from Liz about the fact that there's no citation. Is this not a problem? And I think, again, keep in mind that within this particular writing, this is at a level 1, and so that citation may not be as strong as what we have if someone was into a level 2. But one thing the student has not done is just lifted whole blocks of text from the original source. So one of the things, and Liz, you bring up a really good point, is that we would want to come back and say, according to the author or according to Representative Wells, and give some of that citation as we're moving through.
And the reason we wanted you to see a 111 is the aspect that oftentimes, and we're strong believers that students should see to writing so they know what they should model after. But as instructors in the classroom, we also need to see where we need to get our students initially, because we're still seeing a lot of scorable zeros. And when I look at this, I'm thinking to myself, we can get all of our students here. We really can, or at least most of them, by scaffolding instruction, breaking all these pieces apart so that by the time they're ready to write, they have all the information they need. And it's then just fleshing out the pieces a little bit. So again, bottom line is they need to be able to write first. So should we go back to the PowerPoint and look one more time?
Let's do that, and if we could, let's just show where we can point out just a couple of different things within that one. So if we can pull back over to the actual write-up, if you could go just a couple more slides forward, I think around to slide 38, something like that.
Let's go ahead and finish the process, and then we'll click there, because The next process is revising and editing, and as we talk about traits 2 and 3, a lot of the errors or less effective writing could be dealt with if our students learn to revise and edit on their own. Just rereading it that one last time and seeing how things flow and what would be more effective, least effective, etc. And so you've got some tools for revision and editing. Susan and I often say that the best editor and reviser in the classroom is the teacher. You know, so many of our students, and this has gone for us, the students bring up something and say, read it through. We read it through and we say, if you do this, this, and this would really make it more effective. And so we end up being the revisionist and the editors instead of our students. So having them read it through, and even if they're revising and editing for just a couple things, can create better writing before they do that finished on-demand draft. So and I'm going to go quickly, we did talk initially about trait 1, and so that's what you're seeing on this slide. These are the areas that Susan and I just talked about as we were looking at it. And again, overall, somewhat simplistic and limited, but again, at least a beginning point for us. But some of you also talked a little bit, and Susan, you referenced it, about trait 2, that organization and development of ideas. Here again, this particular writing sample did begin with the writer's argument, but they didn't provide those specific references to the passages, such as you had stated earlier, according to. This one also needs a little more work on transitional devices. Yes, there is some elaboration, but for a level 2 writing, we would want to see better elaboration and development of ideas. Again, formal style and appropriate tone generally, but I'd want to go back in order to get this to a 2 level, formalizing the whole piece of writing. And then again, organizational structure does not really present that opposing position very clearly. So a quick fix as far as adding a stronger counterclaim and rebuttal process to that. So Susan, other things on trait 2 that as you were looking at this paper, you'd say, a few quick fixes.
I don't think so. I mean, quite honestly, you know, as you said earlier, this is one of those writing samples that if I saw this coming from my students, I would just be like, oh, hallelujah, and we would go in and we would fix some. I wouldn't try to overwhelm students. And I think that's the biggest issue, is that we look at their writing and we begin to narrow down what is it we want to focus on, so that our students aren't trying to fix it all.
Definitely.
But, you know, that's one of the big pieces. But if I move over to trait 3, there are a couple things here too. I mean, quite honestly, this student has a bit of a problem when it comes to errors, comma errors, but that's not unusual for a lot of our students, or where they have pronoun antecedent problems or problems with parallel structure. The other thing that we tend to see is that students, we hope at this point, that they'll be able to do a variety of different types of sentences. You know, we don't want to just see these short, chunky sentences moving through. We want to see more clauses or phrases that are attached to sentences, so that students are showing that more sophisticated writing. There are some inconsistencies within this, and I think there's definitely some issues with run-on sentences that are in here. However, we can work with those individual pieces. I think the main thing that, from our perspective, is that pretty much everything hinges off of trait 1. And if we can help our students get those claims, be able to identify the evidence, make sure that they can explain how that's connected, then we're so far ahead of where our students are at this point in time.
So, one step at a time. You have, as we said in your resource guide, a lot of different materials to use. Some will give you some choices But it really, if I would have to say there's one thing we need to really do well, it is getting our students to analyze as they read, interacting with text, and to analyze and evaluate the evidence. If we can get them there, then the rest of it starts flowing for them. So it really is all about that planning or that pre-writing. And of course, making our own thinking process is visible. So as they're seeing us write, they know the steps we go through. They know the questions we ask. Before we take questions, just a couple test-taking tips for the RLA constructed response. We want to make sure that students always complete the constructed response. They still don't realize that those 45 minutes that are provided cannot be used anywhere else on the test. And writing is an extremely important part of today's world. So they do need to at least complete that constructed response. And yes, we know that they can pass the test without writing. However, it continues to be less likely that they'll pass RLA without writing a constructed response. They need to know that they need to always closely read that prompt and source text, analyzing and evaluating that evidence before they ever write the claim, and that they are so comfortable with those writing routines that they can draft that effective response. And what we'd like to ask all of our instructors is make sure that your students have practice using that highlighting tool, the erasable note boards, that they've actually spent some time going through the tutorial. We still have a lot of students who don't realize they can do some of the shortcuts when they're writing. They don't all realize yet that that little box expands as they're keyboarding in. And the other thing is that they need to make sure they plan their time, that they are spending 10 to 15 minutes for reading and planning, that they save a few minutes at the end for proofreading. And you know, we worried that they wouldn't have enough time. Many of our students continue to not spend the entire 45 minutes writing their response. So just a few little tips. So having said that.
So a couple of things, Bonnie, and Pam Adams brings up a really good point here. Do you think a level 1 writing student could be successful as a freshman college student? And I would, my take on this, well, and actually my take on this would be that if you have a student who has really professed that desire to move on to the secondary, I would
lost you, Susan.
That student up to a level 2. Because I think that there's so much, you and I are both doing this, we're popping out every now and then.
Yeah.
I think if we can push them to a level 2, we're much better off because they are more confident in their writing and in the quantity of the writing that they have to do once they're in college. It can make a big difference for them. When you have a student at level 1, they really are beginning to demonstrate skills, and it is much easier to then put them on up to a 2 with some additional practice, focusing in very specifically on certain types of skills. But again, I think a student at the level 1, that really is considered that high school equivalency, and let's push them a little harder and a little higher as they're going on into college so they've got those skills with them.
And I'm going to reiterate what Susan said about quantity. Oftentimes our students who go on to post-secondary ed, one of their big concerns is the fact that I didn't realize I'd have to write so much. So it's not just about quality, it's the fact that they are writing on an ongoing basis and lots of different styles, lots of different audiences. But I agree that the more we can get them to write towards that 2 level, with at least a 2 in some areas, the better off they're going to be being prepared for post-secondary ed.